Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of organization theory. Um, just a quick reminder that this week will be our first discussion forum, and so I'm looking forward to reading your reflections, interacting with you through the Moodle discussion forum. So, just a reminder that I have you all broken into 3 separate groups, so there will be about 7 or 8 of you in each of those groups. So, I did that primarily to focus the discussion a little bit, make it a little bit easier for you to follow the threads and respond to those. So let me know if you have any questions as we get into the discussions this week, but I'm looking forward to that. So we had a fair amount of reading for the first couple of weeks, and the discussion forum will cover these first 2 weeks of reading. So we had from the Rainey book, the first 3 chapters, and then also the first 3 chapters of the Working with Culture from Ann Kademian. So a little bit heavier reading load than perhaps you'll have most weeks, but I did want you to especially to have an opportunity to get into the Working with Culture book early on in the semester so that you could start to think through your culture project and get that in the back of your mind. I think that will help in terms of just being aware as we go through these weeks. Looking at organizations, the readings you do, I think it'll spark some insights and some ideas that maybe you hadn't had before. So what I'm going to do with this lecture is just do a little bit of a brief overview of all of the chapters, and then some of what is in this I'm going to leave to the discussion boards. But I wanted to add at least some of my perspectives and maybe guide you a little bit on the readings. So let's start with the first chapter in the Rainey book, which was really an overview of organization theory, organization behavior. And what I wanted to do with this chapter is just provide some basic definitions that he has in his book so that we're all on the same page. So the first definition I wanted to share was his definition of an organization, which is fairly simple. It's a group of people who work together to pursue a goal or a common purpose. Some of the attributes of an organization is that they attain their resources from their environment. They transform those resources either through the work that they do, the tasks that they do, or the technologies that they apply to that work to pursue and achieve a performance goal. An organization is organized through some sort of leadership process, and the leaders in that organization guide strategies for achieving goals and establishment of structures and processes. So I think it's important to sort of all be on the same page on what we're talking about when we say an organization. He has a definition of organization behavior. I think I mentioned last week that this course is really sort of 2 courses put together. It's both organization theory and organization behavior. And the Rainey book does a pretty nice job of melding those 2 together. So organization behavior, he talks about is focusing on individual and group behaviors within an organization. So we're talking about things like motivation, work satisfaction, leadership and management within the organization, what those people who are in those roles do, work group dynamics, and then the attitudes and behaviors of all of the members of that organization. And then he has his definition of organization theory. He really talks about it's focusing on not individuals and groups, but the organization as a whole, the synthesis of all of those parts. And so in the theory realm, we're talking about the environment that the organization operates within, the goals and the effectiveness and measuring those goals and effectiveness, strategy and decision making, how the organization goes about change and innovation, the structure and design of the organization, and then I added this one in there, the culture of the organization. And Rainey does talk about culture, but I really wanted to make sure that that was part of this list since that is a big focus of this course. In chapter 2, Rainey goes into talking about the evolution of organization theory really over the last century. And a lot of the theorists that he mentions in that chapter are ones that we will be reading about. We'll be reading pieces from many of them throughout this course. But I thought he did a nice job of sort of talking about the evolution of from classical organization theory to present day contemporary organization theory. And I wanted to share sort of that, I guess, some of the aspects of how that evolution has occurred. And so, for example, classical organization theory was really much about highly organized or highly bureaucratic organizations. That has now sort of evolved into how can organizations be more flexible, more organic in their makeup and their operation. We've gone from strong chains of command, where you had primarily vertical up and down communication and decision making within an organization, to organizations that have much more, I would go beyond horizontal communications. They still have vertical communication, but multi-directional communication and decision making, vertical, horizontal, diagonal, across sectors within an organization. Classical organization theory really was about creating jobs that were very specific and didn't change over the long term, whereas that's evolved into much more adaptive, participative, empowering sort of work situations. There was an emphasis on strong control over people, whether that was through hierarchical authority or rules. In classical organization theory, more contemporary theory has evolved towards decentralized and adaptive organizations. We've evolved from closed system thinking to open systems thinking, which is really about, in classical organization theory, they talk about that as being the one best way. That there was a one way for an organization to work at its highest efficiency, and it didn't really matter what the external environment, how that impacted the organization. We've evolved to a point where we understand that the external environment does have a significant influence and impact on our organization. So we're open. That means that the organization itself is open to adapting based on external environmental changes. And then finally, we've evolved from the metaphor of organizations operating as if they were a machine to now organizations being more of a living organism. So I think it's important to understand this evolution. It's important to understand classical organization theory in large part because much of that mindset and much of that structure is still very much embedded in the organizations that we work in now. So even though theorists and innovative organizations have moved towards more adaptive organizational structures and operation, we still are dealing with a very challenging task of evolving our organizations in practice to these more open, adaptive situations. I like to use this photo or this image when I do presentations as sort of the explanation of what this all means. Is the classical was very much hierarchical, linear. We've moved to, on the right side there, much more networked sort of environment. And that's in large part been influenced by technology and the way we are now able to communicate in networks through electronic communication. I also like to share this graph because it's pretty simple, but it also, I think, does a nice job of sort of giving you a sense of what you are facing as a future leader in organizations. We'll talk about classical organization theory and contemporary organization theory, but what will the organizations of the future look like? The ones that you will be leading and managing. This graph that was done by Astro Teller, who's with he's got a great title, Director of Moonshots at X, which is a Google company that really focuses on innovation. And what I like about this is it very simply depicts the challenge that all of us are facing in not only our individual lives, but in organizational lives. We're at a point where innovation and technology is happening faster than our ability to adapt. So how are you going to deal with that as a leader? So there's two lines there, two ways that you could maybe have an influence. And our instinct might be, well, let's slow things down. Let's slow down the pace of change. But we really don't have control or any influence really over that technology, that innovation line. What we do have control over is our own individual lives and our as an organizational leader, our organizational adaptability. And so that's going to be a significant theme that I'm going to present throughout this course is how do we bridge that gap? How do we make our organizations more adaptive? How do we make them learning organizations so that we can affect that human adaptability curve and keep up with the environment that we're working in? So just a couple of quotes that I like that sort of give you a sense of what you'll be facing down the road. This one from Ray Kurzweil, the 21st century will be equivalent to 20,000 years of progress at today's rate of progress. Organizations have to be able to redefine themselves at a faster and faster pace. And then this one from John Cotter, the 21st century will force us all to evolve toward a fundamentally new form of organization. And so that's sort of what we're working towards through this class is understanding organizations as they are and why they are as they are through the evolution of organization theory. And then how do we get to the sorts of organizations, these fundamentally new organizations of the future. And then chapter 3 of Rainey was really focused on the distinction between public organizations and private organizations. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because we will have a discussion forums question about that this week. And so I'll let you work through that a little bit through the discussion forums. But I did want to share just a little bit here. Rainey talks about the generic perspective of organization theory, that being that theorists should emphasize the commonalities among organizations, whether they're public organizations or private organizations. And so that whatever that theory is can apply to any sort of an organization. And in general, that's, I'm a proponent of that as well. I think most of the things about organizations, whether they're business or government or nonprofit, are very similar. Rainey talks about influences such as the size of the organization, the types of work that they do, having a bigger influence over the organization than whether they are distinctly public or private. Management and leadership has a huge impact on organizations and can apply to any sort of public or private organization. But the question is, if there really is not a distinction between public and private organizations, why do public organizations exist? And so that'll be sort of the gist of the discussion this week. As a leader in a public organization, you'll find that there are certainly some environmental constraints and challenges that are a little bit different than public organizations, public companies face. And so that's what we'll talk about in the discussion. So let's talk a little bit about the working with culture readings from this week. Again, just kind of chapter by chapter, a little bit of my thoughts on this. So the first chapter in working with culture, again, let's start with a common definition. And culture is sort of an elusive, difficult thing to define. And so I don't know that I'm going to define it really succinctly here, but this is what one of the ways that academia defines culture: the informal, the symbolic, the subtle, yet nevertheless critical factors that drive the way the job gets done. I think it may have been in the Rainey book somewhere. I think I read a nice analogy also that culture is sort of the personality of an organization. I also think of culture as it's sort of the thing that fills in all of the gaps that aren't specified by formal structure and formal rules and policies and those sorts of things. So it is the ways that the work gets done between the formal written rules. Kadimian talks about how leaders affect culture. So leaders define culture by primarily by what they pay attention to, what they measure, what they try to control, how they handle crises, allocate rewards and sanctions, how they go about recruiting and promoting and retaining employees within the organization. And so, again, culture really is about what actually happens in reality, not so much what an organization's document says that it's about, what the mission statement says, what the strategic plan says. Culture is really about how the work gets done, as Kadimian says. So this is something that's in the Kadimian book, this Edgar Schein's his definition of organizational culture, having three levels that have varying degrees of visibility. And so the most visible aspect of an organization's culture is this, the artifacts, the things that you can see and observe. And so that would be the structure, the organization chart, the mission statement, other symbols, the dress that people commonly wear in an organization, what the office space looks like, those sorts of things that you can see and observe. As we go down into the values, it gets a little bit more difficult to clearly see those. I mean, an organization might have its values written, but as I said earlier, the values are really about what happens in reality. And so how do people move forward in an organization? How do they get rewarded? How do they get punished? Those are the indicators of the real values. And then what Schein says is really the gist of culture is these basic assumptions that are very much hidden. And so this is going to be the real challenge of your culture projects is how do you go about identifying these basic sort of hidden assumptions? What sort of strategies can you employ to help you see those things that really exist in individuals' minds and the sort of the collective mindset of an organization, the attitudes, the mindsets, the perspectives, those sorts of things. I like Kadimian talks about a healthy culture being one that acts as an integrative force, and by that she means an ideal organizational culture is one that integrates the work throughout the organization. So it's the one that makes the connections between different units of the organization across sectors and silos, across subcultures. One of my students this spring did her culture project on the IT organization here at the University of Montana that I work in, and we very clearly have sort of very distinct subcultures, and so part of what you need to think about in your analysis of the organization you pick is what level of integration does the culture have in that organization? Is it actually a positive integrating force that brings people together, or is it more left to just sort of an organic, ground up figuring out of how we get the work done? So there are sort of three hallmarks of culture as an integrative force, as a positive force in an organization. So one is this promotion of excellence, and so these are things you can look for in your organizations. Does the organization value individual initiative and responsibility? Is there participation in decision making across individuals and groups? Is the organization fairly simple in terms of its structure and is there limited specialization within that? The second factor is the robustness of the culture, and so this is really about the depth, how tightly held the organization's culture is, and it's really is the organization's culture committed to an abiding shared purpose, and so that's something you can sort of try to get a sense of is do all the people across an organization are they on the same page in terms of not only what they're trying to accomplish, but why they're trying to accomplish. What's the real deeper purpose of their organization? And then the third aspect of an integrative culture is this capacity to adapt and learn. And as I said earlier, that's one of the most critical things that I think an organizational leader can do going forward. And so I think that involves a lot of empathy, deeply understanding all of the stakeholders, internal and external to the organization. So the people who work within the organization, the people who are served by the organization, sort of external stakeholders, whether that's governing boards or funders. You know, what is their understanding of the organization? Is there some optimism and belief that the organization is able to change? Is it adaptive? Is there a commitment to trying new things, to experimenting? Is there that level of trust within an organization that it's okay to fail because failure is going to be something that we learn from and can move forward? Is there diversity within the organization? That's another hallmark of a really strong culture, is that you're getting different perspectives in your organization. And is there systemic thinking? And by that is the organization as a whole, or individuals within that organization, do they see the bigger picture, the larger vision and purpose of the organization, and do they act? Are they aware of how their actions impact those larger organizational goals and purposes? And so that's an important part of a healthy culture and a healthy organization is, not being sort of embedded in just your little silo or your little work group and not being aware of the bigger picture. The third chapter of the Kadimian book starts to get into the cultural roots framework, which is what I have based this project on. And so wanted to make sure you were starting to get an understanding of what Kadimian means by the cultural roots framework. So there's basically two parts to this. One, she talks about cultures evolving from efforts to conduct public tasks with specific resources and skills in a complex environment. And so that task, resources and skills, and the environment comprise what she calls the roots of culture. And then it's the integration of these three roots that produces commitments, or the rules for how the job gets done, or in essence, the culture of the organization. And so that's part of it. Her theory about how a culture of an organization is formed, and then her belief is that leaders and managers within an organization don't necessarily impact culture directly, but what they do is they impact the roots and how the roots are weaved together and form these commitments. And so a little bit of an abstract concept, it may not be completely clear now, but that's part of the learning process in this class, and part of why we wanted to get started on this early on. So there will be some discussion this week about this particular aspect of the Kadimian book as well. So I do want to say a little bit more about what Kadimian means about commitments. And I don't know, again, if there's a real concise, clear, simple definition, but here are some of the things that she talks about that are aspects of an organization's commitments. So commitments are the thing that provide context, that allow people to interpret and approach their work. commitments provide a guide for action and reaction, and so they're sort of the values that we act upon within an organization. They can serve as a coping mechanism, especially in times of crisis. They can also serve as an innovative, collaborative, adaptive force within an organization. She talks about these commitments might exist in a very coherent package that is deliberate and meant to move an organization forward, or they might be a little bit more chaotic and just sort of they just happen. They might be more so a product of kind of the history of an organization, and so I definitely see this in the organization I work in, sort of that chaotic, not clear, concise, simple picture of what the commitments are. She also says that the commitments aren't necessarily etched in a rule book. In fact, they probably aren't etched in a rule book. But you may find that an organization does have, a written mission statement and a written set of values that they very much follow, and that they really do guide action and decision making. And she says they exist because people do act upon them and make decisions based on them. And so hopefully that helps a little bit with the readings for the first couple of weeks. I look forward to engaging with you in the discussion boards this week, and let me know if you have any questions or issues as the week goes on. Thank you.